I had a friend who got himself into trouble once. One night, he had to run a quick errand, and he decided to take a shortcut through a part of town that people really didn't go to after dark. It wasn't long before problems developed. His car was surrounded, he was pulled from it, he was beaten. He was fortunate because he didn't suffer very serious injuries. It could have been a lot worse. But he put himself in danger by doing what he did. We place ourselves in spiritual danger when we get into the wrong side of spiritual thinking. And the best way to keep temptation from dragging us into its snare is to know what it looks like in its natural environment. And to discover that, let's turn to Solomon and listen to a father-son discussion about the dangers of life. In the middle of the Bible is the book called Proverbs. Our usual view of Proverbs, it is a curation of wisdom sayings, those pithy things that we turn over and over in our minds and we puzzle about. For instance, Proverbs 22 and verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it." Now, for centuries, parents have struggled over that verse and made it a guarantee. And yet it's a general principle that if the training starts early, the result will probably be good. The Greeks had a companion proverb that said, "As a twig is bent, so goes the tree." Or how about this proverb? "As a door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard on his bed." Proverbs 26:14. We all know we have problems with procrastination, and others do as well. And Solomon looked at life and he said, this is a problem, and his vivid image communicates so much about what is true and what needs to happen. Yet Solomon probably had a greater purpose than just tickling our minds. Proverbs, it has been said, has been a training manual for the young on how to rule a nation. It is probably a way that Solomon prepared younger people for how to live. And perhaps Solomon thought about his own life. He was born in Bathsheba, the woman who David engaged in illegitimate affair. And after his father died, there was political intrigue and treachery. How could he prepare the next king to be the kind of man and the kind of king that he needs to be? If that be true, it's obvious from history that he failed with his own son, Rehoboam. And yet I think there's a general sense of this training. To avoid the pitfalls of life and please God, the instruction is just as important to us. It tells us how to live, and it tells us how to live to avoid troubles. And so one of the places we meet this principle of instruction is in Proverbs chapter 5. And the opening chapter gives the purpose of that passage. He says, beginning at verse 1, "My son, be attentive to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding, so that you might keep discretion, and your lips may guard knowledge." Now, I want you to focus on a particular word there, and that's the word discretion. We usually think of discretion as the quality of behaving in such a way not to reveal personal information. But Solomon uses it a little differently because of the way the term is used in Hebrew. In the Hebrew language, the term has as its root a strategy or a plan for life. And Solomon is trying to teach that there is a way to stay on your plan for living and a way that gets you off of that path. So this is something necessary to heed to avoid the troubles in spiritual life. His purpose, I think, for us this morning is to look at this and say, how do you steer clear of the problems that you will get yourself into if you're not careful? And so he issues a warning in this chapter in Proverbs chapter 5. And in it, there's this contrast between the foolish living and the wise living, as is so often the case in wisdom literature. Here, it is personified as a woman of loose morals, the one who hangs in the street to woo the inattentive buffoon. She is a woman who entices, a woman who makes you forget who you are and who you are around. And that's an apt description of the temptress of our souls, not just of our flesh. James, the writer of the book of the New Testament, was fond of wisdom literature, and he sprinkled allusions to it throughout his book. And in James 1, you hear a lot of what Proverbs may be trying to say in this chapter. James chapter 1, 13 to 15, which we've seen again and again, listen to it to its very end. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil. And he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then that desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. For James, temptation is a flirtation with evil. One that, if you let it go long enough, results in a terrible fate. And in those verses, you hear the echoes of Proverbs 5. For in Proverbs 5, Solomon says, be careful who you listen to, because there are many things wrong with listening to that voice. And as we've seen, the voice that whispers in our ear so often is the voice of the devil himself. And if you take evil personified in this passage, it does several things. First, it presents you an illusion. An illusion is the appearance that something is real when it's really not. A magician uses you to convince you that a woman in a box that is sawn in half and separated, that you must have cut the woman in half. He hasn't. It's a trick. It's an illusion. The carnival barker will use illusion to persuade you to pay good money for a basketball to throw through a hoop. It's barely large enough to hold the ball itself. It looks like it, but it's not. And evil has that same kind of pleasant appearance that doesn't really seem too sinister. If you look at verse 3, the appearance of evil is very pleasant. The appearance of temptation is very, very appealing. He says, for the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. This is the enticement of evil. It looks good. It looks pleasant. And it's not dangerous at all. It has the sweet taste of honey and the silky finish of oil against the soul. It makes you lick your lips and want to caress it slowly. But Solomon goes on to say, that's just the appearance. You're going to find out where it leads. But in the end, she's bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. In the end. It is a word that has the sense of destination. When you get to where it leads, it's not quite so pleasant. And if you just listen to his comparison, instead of honey, it's like wormwood or gall. The honey tastes more like vinegar than honey. It burns and makes you gag if you swallow it. Who wants that? And yet it looked and tasted like honey originally. It's like a two-edged sword. The saber that was used to quickly cut and eviscerate before a person could defend himself. Or as the phrase goes, he never knew what hit him. This is what the end looks like. This is where it goes. See, the problem of evil is that it presents a cobra wrapped in a pretty package. When you open it, it bites. You can't trust what's told you. You can't trust what you see because it's an illusion. One year I was going back home from a trip and I was on a Southwest Airlines flight, and the flight attendant came by, as they always do, and they say, what would you like to drink? And I gave her my usual answer, Diet Coke. Well, in a few minutes, she returned with a tray, and she handed me a cup that had sparkling bubbles in it, and it looked just like Diet Coke. I raised it toward my lips, and it got close to my nose, and I realized it wasn't Diet Coke. There was something else in there. And she could probably tell from the look on my face that this was not the right thing. So she took it quickly and said, "I'm sorry, let me get you what you need." It looked the same right up until you got to where it got to you. And that's the problem with evil. Evil looks pleasant. Evil looks enticing. Evil presents its best face. But then, evil puts you under a spell and deludes you. A delusion is when you believe something even though all the evidence to the contrary makes it unbelievable. I have known men in my lifetime who believe that when Apollo 11's men, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, walked on the moon, they didn't. That was just made up, filmed on a soundstage in Las Vegas and portrayed as that, but it never really did happen, even though several walked on the moon. There are others that even in 1968 still believe the earth was flat. And some of them even maintained that after Apollo 8 had shot its picture from the moon of Earth as the big blue marble. The delusions that we have are pretty powerful. And the way that evil presents itself is kind of delusion. It says that she does not ponder the paths of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. She doesn't pay attention to consequences. Evil doesn't ask about consequences. It asks about right now. It says, are you enjoying yourself now? Well, what is this going to cost you? Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. That is what evil does. You don't have to worry about where it's going. You'll like it while you're doing it. It's kind of like walking through a poison ivy patch and just noticing the pretty plants. The itch takes place later. There's a certain aimlessness to it. You're not thinking about the future, only the very present moment where it feels so good that you forget everything else is happening. And that is the delusion. Where does this course of action lead? We don't ask that question. Because most people think it's pretty innocent. All evil begins as an innocent activity. No one goes into thinking, let me see how bad I can make my life. Instead, they say, this looks pretty good, let's try it. And then again, and again, and again. And at least they will say, I'm immune, this does not bother me. But every human scandal has occurred in the same way. It believes a delusion. We've had two in the last several years that have hit the front page of news sites. One was the college cheating scandal that sent both popular actresses, Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman, to jail. But it was based on a very simple idea. I just want to get my kids into the university of their choice. Now, not once did they consider where that might take them when they signed on the dotted line and paid the money. I doubt either one of them thought to themselves, I will be found out one day. I imagine both of them believed their celebrity would get them off if something went wrong. And at least they could plead that we are just mothers who care for our children. But they pursued a course headlong without thinking about bars and orange jumpsuits. Because we don't, when evil gives us the delusion that we don't have to do anything in the future to pay for it. Let's take 3 years ago. I was coming back to the Houston airport the day after the Houston Astros won the World Series. The town was turned upside down. Everybody was happy. They were world champions. They had hoisted the trophy above their heads. They wore the hats. They wore the T-shirts. Everything looked good. That lasted for about a year. But a year later, it was discovered that the way they won was they stole the signs from the picture. Now, that doesn't seem too bad. After all, Doesn't everybody do what it takes to win? The problem was they crossed the line. And nobody at the beginning stopped to ask the question, what happens if someone finds out, but they got found out? And there was a cost associated with it. The delusion evaporated because suddenly a general manager lost his career, a baseball manager lost his profession, and a player who had gone on to manage another team had lost his position and his future. See, the delusion is very basic. I will enjoy it, not think about tomorrow. But the third thing that Solomon goes on to say, but understand, the piper must be paid someday. The time comes when the bill comes due. The Apostle Paul told the Romans in Romans 6 and verse 23, for the wages of sin is death. There is a time when evil asks for its wages. It asks to be paid. It goes to the paymaster, demand what is due it. When sin happens in a life, there comes a day where sin has to be recompensed for. Someone has to pay. Solomon will go on to say in Proverbs 5 and verse 11, and at the end of your life you groan, when your flesh and body are consumed. Now this is the second time the phrase in the end is used in this passage. The first was in verse 4, where it talked about the pleasure of the moment tasted like, what it tasted like later. In other words, the honey became gall. That when you get to the point where it's not as pleasant anymore. But here, it talks about the ultimate destination. It's not just how bitter it is, but how devastating it is. The words that he uses, says it groans, and he uses this word that describes intense shooting pain. And it's kind of like walking through your house in the middle of the night, and you catch your little toe on the edge of the dresser, and you hop around like somebody has set you on fire. And it hurts, and you may even ache and cry a little bit. That's the word he talks about. Then he says, it is also a life spent till flesh and body are consumed. And the term consumed there means to vanish. Whatever you expected from life, under the influences of sin, vanishes like a mist. It's not going to last. See, the reality of consequence is it chops away life that you expected and that you wanted, and now you're left with the aftermath. Just remember David. I imagine David planned to grow old as a king, admired by his children, with his grandchildren sitting around him, caring for him. It was going to be peace, harmony, and a good old age. And then came 2 Samuel chapter 11. He saw a woman. He asked about her. He invited her into his chamber, and he committed adultery. He handed a writ to his commander Joab about the order of battle and to put a man named Uriah, a trusted friend, in the forefront and make sure he doesn't come back alive. And all was peace until an old prophet named Nathan came to his midst in 2 Samuel chapter 12. And as he unrolled the story of the little ewe lamb, and David became incensed and pronounced the sentence, Nathan agreed. You're that man, and you pronounced your sentence. And at that moment, his life began to unravel in ways he had never thought about before. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 10 through 11, give a snapshot of the rest of his life. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, because I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. I will take away your wives before your eyes, and I'll give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with them in the sight of the sun. And as the chapters would unfold in 2 Samuel, the pain and suffering would get more intense. He had one son who would rape one of his daughters. Her brother would then kill this other son. The son who committed murder would lead a rebellion against his father David. and as a sign of utter contempt, commit adultery with the concubine on the roof of David's own palace so the whole city could witness the degradation. And then that son will be run through with a sword while he's hanging by his hair from a branch of a tree. Pestilence would come. Suffering would take place. And even in the end, his kingdom was unsettled by political intrigue and an attempted coup. And yet, what someone wants to tell us about the end of our life and how bad it can be, an end that we did expect, not think about. This is not just sordid ill woe. It's a stern warning, but it's a solution given to it. He says in Proverbs 5 and 8, keep away far from her and do not go near her house. Don't go down the street where she lives, and you won't be enticed. Don't start a journey of danger thinking there is none. And what he talks about is the problem of proximity. Now, we're going to examine that in detail in a coming lesson. But Solomon says nearness is a problem. If you're struggling with something, if you have a desire for something, if it's a problem for you, don't go around it. You know, there's this rising plague of pornography in our society right now. Once you had to go to a seedy bookstore in the shadows on the other side of town, a place that you didn't want anybody to see who you were. And you sneak in and sneak out. That's what people would do. There's a social stigma attached to it. So it wasn't too much of a problem. But now, a laptop with an internet connection will bring it right into your house. And isn't that a reason why this has taken a foothold so badly? The alcoholic who craves a drink should not spend time waiting for a delayed flight in the airport bar. I've seen it in my own life. Witnessed as a boy. We attended a small church in northern New Mexico. One of those churches, it didn't have elders, and the men who were in their 30s were having to deal with problems that really only age equips you for. One of those problems involved a song leader, a very nice guy. He really was. And he's a pretty good song leader. And that's hard to find in any size congregation. And like any small church, ones everywhere it seems, a man would take the collection trays. He would go back in the church office and he'd count the money and then he'd give it to whoever. Well, the problem was that when he counted the money, if he was running short for the week, he'd just take some of the cash out. It wasn't long before the problem could not be hidden. I remember my father and another man had to go to his house and confront him. He was tearful. He repented. But the interesting thing about those young men, they were wise enough not to let him count the money again. Solomon says, if something is a problem, if something entices you, if something is your desire, don't go to where it sits. Don't go to where it lives. Avoid it at all costs. And that way you can avoid the delusion and the illusion and the consequences. But you see, what Solomon warns is an ever-present danger to us. Because evil always dresses enticingly. It looks innocent. It's even pleasant. But it's easy to fall under the illusion of evil and to be deluded that it's not really a danger to your soul. So how do you approach life knowing this lesson, which is all too easy to forget? One is to remember your values. What Solomon reinforces is that people who are enticed tend to forget themselves. They get caught up in the enjoyment, the titillation, the pleasure. But he says stop and get clear about something. Who are you in the first place? Who do you represent in this world? And is that important? Is your reputation important? Is your Christian identity important? Does this reflect on Christ, the Christ I serve and the Christ whose name I wear? And how is that going to reflect? He says, if you stop and ask some questions every once in a while, it'll give you pause. And perhaps you'll go, I think I'll turn away from that right now and not go that direction. For most people, they need to get clear and get even with their values and remind themselves of it on a regular basis. Because in the heat of the battle, you won't remember, so you better keep it front of mind. But the second is to remember the cost. It will cost you something one day if you give in. The hardest thing we'd have to do is to envision the worst possible future. We all want to be optimists about our own behavior. And yet, there's a reality. The reality is there is something that will come about. There will be a cost. And it doesn't always immediately show up. It may take a long time. It may take in the afterlife. It may take an eternity. The Romans had a phrase called momentum mori. It was used by philosophers of both Greek and Rome in the centuries before Jesus and the centuries after. It meant there would be a moment of death, that life would come to an end. The second century Christian writer Tertullian claimed that during the triumphal procession, a victorious general would have someone, usually a slave, standing behind him, holding a crown over his head and whispering in his ear, "Look after you," meaning to the time after your death. "And remember, you're only a man." See, the day will come where if you escape all the problems in this life, you can't escape the problems in the next. And the bill will come due at the worst possible time. And then, what will you say in that moment? If you can just remember that the moment's coming, that there is a memento mori in your life, you may say, "I think I'll pass, thank you." But because it is so enticing, it is easy to lose something. Something Chuck Colson found out too late. Colson had two lives, life before prison and life after prison. Before prison, he was the mastermind of the Watergate break-in that brought down Richard Nixon. He hired the men who did it and paid them. He lied about it to Congress and prosecutors, and he got caught. He was headed in the wrong direction. He ended up going to prison, but after prison, he founded a ministry to reach out to those in prison and share the message of Christ with them and to help those unjustly convicted. And when did life come into focus for him? He tells a story that in 1973, while he was looking for work after leaving the White House, he was afraid that he was going to wind up in jail, which he did. In fact, he knew he was going that way. So Colson got into his car. He found himself in the grip of a spiritual crisis that ended up leading to a conversion. And he tells his own story. He said, "I sat there, this so-called White House hatchet man, this ex-Marine captain, and I was crying too hard to get the keys into the ignition. I sat there for a long time that night, deeply convicted of my own sin." Such is the problem of evil when it comes and entices, that you may find yourself with bitter tears, wanting to change. Listen to the wise man and see if you can avoid that and not go there. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next Sunday.